The missing persons file sat on Detective Sarah Martinez's desk like a curse, its edges worn and frayed from countless hours of obsessive handling. 18 months, 547 days. She knew the exact number because she'd counted every single one of them. Emma Richardson, 3 years old, blonde pigtails that bounced when she ran, dimpled smile that could light up an entire room, had vanished without a trace from Riverside Park in Portland, Oregon, on a sunny Tuesday afternoon in March. The case had consumed Sarah's life in ways she never could have imagined. Her marriage had crumbled like old paper, her husband finally issuing an ultimatum, the case or him. She'd chosen the case, and now she sat alone in her apartment most nights, surrounded by crime scene photos, witness statements, and the haunting image of a little girl's face plastered across missing persons flyers. Sarah had sacrificed everything for this case: her sleep, her sanity, her relationships, her career prospects. Other detectives had moved on to promotions and new assignments. Her captain had suggested, repeatedly and with increasing firmness, that she take a vacation, seek counseling, let someone else handle the investigation. But Sarah couldn't let go. She'd been the first responder to the park that day, the first detective on scene. She'd looked into Emma's mother's eyes as the woman collapsed in absolute terror, realizing her daughter was gone. Sarah had made an unspoken promise in that moment. She would find the child or die trying. The investigation had been exhausting and soul-crushing. Sarah had followed every lead, chased every phantom tip, interviewed every suspicious neighbor, homeless person, and registered sex offender within a 50-mile radius. She'd organized search parties that combed through forests and ravines until her feet bled and her voice gave out from calling Emma's name. She'd knocked on doors in the pouring rain at midnight, desperation in her eyes, hoping that someone, anyone, had seen something useful. The tips had poured in at first, hundreds of them. A child matching Emma's description spotted at a gas station in Seattle. A blonde-haired girl seen getting into a blue van near the coast. A man matching a vague suspect description at a truck stop in Idaho. Sarah had personally investigated each lead, driving countless miles, sleeping in her car, eating stale convenience store food. Every single lead had evaporated like morning mist. The psychological toll had been catastrophic. Sarah started seeing Emma's face in her dreams, not the happy photographs from her family's album, but twisted, distorted versions of her face full of pain and terror. She'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. She stopped going to the gym, stopped calling her mother, stopped pretending that everything was normal. Her apartment became a shrine to the case, walls covered with maps, timelines, suspects' photographs, evidence reports. Her colleagues whispered that she was losing it, that the case had broken her mind. Maybe they were right. Then came the day that everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning, 18 months to the week after Emma's disappearance. Sarah was in the middle of her morning coffee, her 5th cup, when her phone rang. It was a jogger breathing heavily, speaking in urgent, panicked tones. "There's a child," the jogger gasped. "A little girl, she's alone, she's by the river near mile marker 7. She's barefoot and bleeding. I think something terrible has happened to her." Sarah's heart had stopped. Every instinct screamed that this was it. She'd broken approximately 15 traffic laws getting to Riverside, her sirens wailing like banshees through the Portland morning. When she arrived, there she was, a small, filthy child standing near the water's edge, wearing a torn pink dress, her feet caked in mud and blood, her blonde hair matted and dirty. It was Emma. After 18 months of darkness, Emma Richardson had been found. But the discovery brought an immediate and crushing problem. When Sarah knelt beside the child, tried to comfort her, asked her what had happened, Emma didn't respond. Not a word. The girl's eyes were wide and distant, staring at nothing, as if her consciousness had traveled somewhere far away to escape the horrors her body had endured. At the hospital, the pediatricians examined her gently, documenting bruises and shapes that suggested hands, marks that suggested restraints, injuries that painted a picture of systematic abuse. Sarah sat outside Emma's hospital room, devastated and furious. The child had survived. That was a miracle. But the psychological damage was catastrophic. The hospital's pediatric psychologist, Dr. Marcus Webb, had delivered the crushing verdict with the gentleness of someone who delivered bad news thousands of times before. He sat down beside Sarah, his expression grave, his words measured and careful. "Selective mutism," he'd said quietly. "She's experienced severe trauma, the kind that fractures the psyche. Speaking might trigger memories too painful for her developing mind to process. Her brain is protecting her by shutting down communication. There's no guarantee she'll ever talk about what happened. Some trauma victims never do. They carry the scars forever in silence." Sarah felt the case crumbling in real time. Without Emma's testimony, the evidence was maddeningly circumstantial. They had fiber evidence, DNA under her fingernails, her location coordinates. But a good defense attorney, and Robert Vasquez had money, which meant he'd hire the best, would systematically dismantle their case. They'd argue that the DNA could have been transferred innocently. The fibers could have come from anywhere. The location was circumstantial. Without the victim's testimony, without a child's voice identifying her abuser, Robert Vasquez would walk free on a technicality. Robert Vasquez. Just thinking his name made Sarah's jaw clench with rage. The man arrested at his apartment had cold, calculating eyes that seemed to belong to something inhuman. 32 years old, no criminal record, worked as a handyman and landscaper. He'd been recommended to Emma's parents through a church community board. He'd had access to the park. He had a basement. He had the capacity for evil. The evidence pointed to him like a flashing neon sign. But the legal system demanded proof beyond reasonable doubt. And without Emma's voice, without her pointing at him and saying, "Yes, that's the man who hurt me," justice would die on the vine. Sarah sat in the hospital hallway for hours, her mind spiraling into despair. That's when her phone rang. Officer Mike Chen from the K-9 unit had called with a suggestion so unconventional, so outside the box, that it seemed absolutely insane. But desperation makes people consider impossible things, and Sarah Martinez was desperate enough to try anything. The hospital room felt suffocating, like the walls were slowly closing in, squeezing the air from Sarah's lungs. Emma sat curled in the corner of her hospital bed, her small frame huddled beneath a pale blue blanket covered in cheerful cartoon characters that seemed obscenely out of place given the circumstances. Her thumb was in her mouth, a regressive behavior the doctors said was completely normal for a traumatized child, and her eyes stared at absolutely nothing, gazing through the hospital window into some distant, private hell that only she could see. Sarah had been sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside the bed for 3 hours, saying nothing, just being present, hoping that her physical proximity might somehow communicate safety and love to the broken child. Dr. Marcus Webb knocked softly on the door before entering, his gray hair slightly disheveled, his expression grave with the weight of difficult truths he'd had to deliver countless times before. He carried Emma's preliminary psychological evaluation, a thick folder filled with assessments, observations, and recommendations. Sarah stood to meet him, her heart already sinking. She could read his face like a book, and what she saw there was not hope. The doctor gestured for her to step into the hallway, away from Emma's ears, a gesture that communicated the seriousness of what he was about to say. "Selective mutism," he said quietly, his voice carrying the careful cadence of someone delivering devastating news. "It's a complex anxiety disorder, particularly severe in children who have experienced profound trauma. Emma's mind has essentially shut down her ability to communicate as a protective mechanism. It's her psyche's way of saying, if I don't speak about what happened, maybe I can pretend it didn't." Sarah felt her knees weaken. How long until she talks? "That's the difficult part," Dr. Webb continued, adjusting his glasses with a tired gesture. "In some cases, weeks or months, in others, years, and in a small percentage of cases," he paused, choosing his words carefully, In some cases, the trauma is so severe that the child never fully recovers verbal communication about the traumatic event. They may speak about other things eventually, but the specific memories, the details of what happened, those might remain locked away forever, protected by a mind that knows it cannot yet handle them. Sarah leaned against the hospital wall, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. What about therapy, medication, hypnosis? There has to be something we can do. There are therapeutic interventions we can attempt, Dr. Webb said. But detective, I need to be honest with you. The window for testimony is closing. Trial is scheduled for 4 months from now. The prosecution needs Emma to identify her abuser. Without her testimony, your case becomes circumstantial. A good defense attorney will exploit that weakness relentlessly. Sarah closed her eyes. She knew he was right. She'd been in law enforcement long enough to understand how the criminal justice system worked, or didn't work. Juries needed narrative. They needed a victim's voice, a child's finger pointing at the man who'd hurt her, saying, yes, that's him. They needed the emotional truth that only an eyewitness could provide. Circumstantial evidence, no matter how damning, always created reasonable doubt in jurors' minds. Robert Vasquez had already posted bail. His family had money, and he was out there, somewhere in Portland, possibly planning his next move. Tell me what we can do, Sarah said desperately. There has to be something. Dr. Webb sighed, a sound heavy with the burden of his profession. We try talk therapy. We try play therapy where she communicates through toys and drawings instead of words. We try medications that might reduce her anxiety. But detective, I want you to prepare yourself for the possibility that Emma may never testify. We might have to prosecute this case without her voice. Sarah walked back into the hospital room and looked at the small child on the bed. Emma's thumb remained in her mouth. Her eyes remained vacant. The detectives had shown her photographs of Robert Vasquez, asked if she recognized him, and received nothing but hollow stares. Emma's foster mother, Janet, a kind woman in her 60s who'd cared for trauma victims her entire career, sat on the other side of the bed, reading a picture book aloud in a gentle voice, as if normalcy and storytelling could somehow rewire a shattered mind. Over the next week, Sarah visited Emma every day. She brought coloring books and crayons. She brought stuffed animals and picture books. She sat quietly, hoping that her presence might build trust, might create a safe space where Emma could eventually find her voice. But Emma remained silent. Completely, absolutely silent. She would color sometimes, her small hands moving the crayons with mechanical precision, but she never once looked at Sarah, never once made eye contact. Never once acknowledged the detective's presence with any gesture or sound. The silence was deafening. It was a screaming silence, louder than any words could be. It screamed of pain and terror and betrayal. It screamed of a child's trust in the world shattered beyond recognition. Sarah found herself crying in her car after these visits, sitting in the hospital parking lot, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, screaming silently herself because the frustration and helplessness were too overwhelming for any human to contain. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. Sarah's team had gathered evidence. Fiber samples from Vasquez's basement matched fibers found on Emma's dress. DNA under her fingernails matched his skin cells. A search of his home revealed a basement with a blue door, matching the description that had been recovered from Emma's fragmented, nonverbal communications with therapists. She'd drawn the blue door repeatedly, always in dark, angry crayon strokes. Everything pointed to Vasquez. Everything screamed his guilt. But without Emma's voice, without her testimony, it all remained circumstantial. Sarah attended prosecution meetings where the assistant district attorney, Jennifer Hayes, expressed her growing concern. We have solid evidence, Jennifer said, spreading photographs across the table. But juries want the victim's voice, especially in cases involving children. Without Emma testifying, the jury may interpret her silence as doubt. Defense will argue she's unreliable, confused, possibly misidentified Vasquez. They'll paint her silence as evidence of uncertainty rather than trauma. Sarah's captain called her into his office. "Martinez, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this case might not go to trial. We might have to accept a plea deal or face acquittal. I know you've sacrificed everything for this investigation, but sometimes the system fails us. Sometimes monsters walk free." The words made Sarah want to vomit. The idea that Robert Vasquez could walk free, could return to his handyman business, could potentially hunt for another child. It was unbearable. She returned to the hospital that evening and sat beside Emma's bed, watching the small girl sleep, her face peaceful in unconsciousness, free from the nightmares that plagued her waking hours. Sarah whispered a promise to the sleeping child. "I will find a way. I don't know how yet, but I will find a way to make him pay. Your voice will be heard, Emma. Somehow, I will make sure of it." That night, Officer Mike Chen's phone call arrived, and with it came a possibility Sarah hadn't dared to imagine. Officer Mike Chen's voice crackled through Sarah's phone with an urgency that immediately captured her attention. She'd been sitting in her apartment at midnight, surrounded by case files, the television playing in the background providing nothing but white noise to combat the suffocating silence of her empty home. When her phone rang, she nearly jumped out of her skin. "Sarah, it's Mike. I have an idea, and I know it sounds absolutely insane, but hear me out," Mike said, speaking quickly, his words tumbling over each other with the enthusiasm of someone who just had an epiphany. "I've been thinking about Emma's case, about the testimony problem. What if there was a way to help her feel safe enough to communicate?" "Mike, the doctors have tried everything," Sarah said wearily. "Therapy, play therapy, medication, nothing's working. Her selective mutism is." "I'm not talking about traditional therapy," Mike interrupted. "I'm talking about Duke." There was a moment of silence on Sarah's end of the line. She blinked, wondering if she'd heard correctly. "Duke, your dog. Mike, I appreciate the gesture, but bringing a therapy dog to help Emma isn't going to solve the courtroom problem. She needs to testify and—" "Sarah, listen to me," Mike said, his voice becoming more intense, more passionate. 6 months ago, we had a case. Sexual assault victim, 23 years old, hadn't spoken in 3 weeks. Completely traumatized, selective mutism similar to Emma's. The prosecution thought they'd lose the case. Then I brought Duke into the interview room just casually, just to see what would happen. Within 5 minutes of Duke's presence, that woman started talking. She testified at trial. Her abuser is now serving 15 years. Sarah's heart began to accelerate. "Mike, how is that possible? How does a dog?" "Animals are therapeutic, Sarah. There's actual science behind it. Dogs reduce cortisol, that's the stress hormone, and increase oxytocin, the bonding hormone. They create a sense of safety that humans sometimes can't achieve. Duke isn't just trained as a police dog. He's completed specialized trauma victim support certification. He's a bridge between the traumatized psyche and the external world." Sarah stood up, packing her small apartment, her mind racing with possibilities. But even if Emma could communicate with Duke, that doesn't solve the courtroom problem. She still has to testify in front of the judge, the jury, the defendant. A dog can't be in the witness box with her. "That's where you're wrong," Mike said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "There's no law against a support animal being present during testimony. It's unusual, yes, but it's not illegal, and judges have discretion in cases involving child witnesses. If we can convince the judge that Emma's testimony is impossible without Duke's presence, that the dog is essential to the child's ability to communicate about the trauma, we might be able to get him into that courtroom." Sarah stopped packing. Her mind was spinning with the implications. Could it work? Could Duke somehow unlock Emma's voice? "Mike, I need to talk to the judge. I need to present this idea to Jennifer, the prosecutor. This is unconventional, very unconventional." "That's why you have to present it carefully," Mike cautioned. "Don't frame it as some magical cure. Frame it as therapeutic support that has a documented history of success. Frame it as an accommodation for a traumatized child witness. Make it about Emma's ability to participate in her own justice." The next morning, Sarah arranged an emergency meeting with Judge Patricia Woodson in her chambers. The judge was a veteran of the bench, 62 years old, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen every manipulation, every trick, every desperation play that the legal system could manufacture. Sarah knew approaching Judge Woodson with an unconventional request required careful preparation and compelling evidence. Sarah brought research papers on animal-assisted therapy, case studies of traumatized witnesses who'd been helped by support animals, and documentation of Duke's specialized training. She brought photographs of Duke, a magnificent golden German shepherd with intelligent brown eyes and a calm demeanor that seemed to radiate peace. She brought her own desperation, her own unwavering belief that this could work. "Your Honor, I know this sounds unconventional," Sarah began, standing in front of the judge's imposing desk, her hands slightly trembling. "But I wouldn't be here if I wasn't absolutely certain that this is Emma's only chance at justice. Without this accommodation, we lose the case. Robert Vasquez walks free, and frankly, Your Honor, I believe he will hunt again." Judge Woodson leaned back in her leather chair, studying Sarah carefully. "Detective, I've been on the bench for 34 years. I've seen creative defense strategies, innovative prosecution approaches, and everything in between. But I've never seen a request to bring a police dog into a murder trial for therapeutic purposes." "It's not just therapeutic," Sarah argued, spreading the research papers across the judge's desk. "There's documented evidence that support animals reduce anxiety, increase feelings of safety, and enable trauma victims to access memories and communication that would otherwise remain locked away. Officer Chen has used Duke successfully in 3 other cases. In each case, the victim testified effectively, and the perpetrator was convicted." Judge Woodson picked up one of the research papers, scanning it with the careful attention of someone trained in evaluating evidence. "And you believe this dog, Duke, is it? Can help a 3-year-old child speak about being kidnapped and abused?" "I believe he's her best chance," Sarah said firmly. "Your Honor, I've been on this case for 18 months. I've followed every lead, explored every avenue. The traditional approaches have failed. Emma is locked in a prison of trauma. Duke might be the key that unlocks her voice." The judge set down the paper and folded her hands on her desk. "This is highly irregular, detective. The defense will object strenuously. They'll argue it's unfair, that the presence of a dog will prejudice the jury in favor of the child's testimony, that it's theatrical and manipulative." "Let them argue," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "But the legal precedent supports accommodating child witnesses. We already allow therapy dogs in courtrooms in certain jurisdictions. We allow support persons to sit with victims during testimony. We make accommodations for children with disabilities, for witnesses with PTSD. Why should Emma be any different? The law is supposed to serve justice, Your Honor. Justice for a 3-year-old girl who lost everything." Judge Woodson was quiet for a long moment, her eyes studying Sarah's face with the intensity of someone trying to read the truth of another human being. Finally, she spoke. "I'm going to allow this. But detective, understand that if this goes badly, if this looks like manipulation, or if the defense successfully argues that the dog prejudiced the jury, it could compromise the entire case. The conviction could be overturned on appeal." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "Thank you, Your Honor, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Judge Woodson said sternly. "You still have to get that child to speak. A dog in the courtroom doesn't guarantee anything. It's just a tool. Emma still has to find her own voice." That afternoon, Sarah called Mike Chen. "We're doing this," she said. "We're bringing Duke to trial, but Mike, we need to prepare him. We need to prepare Emma. We need to make absolutely certain that when that dog walks into that courtroom, it works." "It will work," Mike said with confidence. "Trust me, Sarah, Duke has a gift. He knows how to reach broken people. And Emma is the strongest 3-year-old I've ever heard of. She survived something that would have destroyed many adults. If anyone can do this, it's her." Sarah hung up the phone and looked at the photograph of Emma that had been plastered on missing persons posters for 18 months, a bright-eyed, dimpled child radiating joy and innocence. In less than 4 months, that child would have to face the man who'd stolen her childhood, who'd inflicted unspeakable horrors upon her tiny body. And she would have to do it with only a dog for protection. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing, but Sarah had no choice. This was Emma's only chance. Duke was their secret weapon, their last desperate hope that justice might actually prevail over the machinery of the legal system. The trial date was set. The courtroom was prepared, and somewhere in a training facility in Portland, a golden German shepherd named Duke began his most important assignment, being a bridge between a broken child and the voice she desperately needed to reclaim. Trial day arrived with thunder and rain, as if the heavens themselves were weeping for the injustice that had been perpetrated against an innocent child. The Portland sky hung low and gray, heavy clouds pressing down over the city like a suffocating blanket. Sarah stood outside the courthouse at 6 in the morning, watching the rain streak down the glass doors, her stomach twisted into knots so tight she could barely breathe. She'd been awake since 3 a.m., unable to sleep, her mind replaying every possible scenario, every way this could go catastrophically wrong. The media had descended on the courthouse like vultures sensing blood in the water. News vans lined the streets, satellite dishes pointing toward the sky, reporters practicing their lines in front of mirrors, desperate to be the one who broke the story about the 3-year-old testimony and the police dog. The story had leaked somehow. Sarah suspected it was intentional, a strategic move by the prosecution to prepare the jury and the public for something unconventional. But the media circus made everything feel more high stakes, more fragile, more prone to disaster. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with messages from other detectives, well-wishers, people who'd heard about the case and wanted to express their support. But the messages felt hollow, performative, like people playing a part in someone else's tragedy. The only message that mattered was from Officer Mike Chen. Duke is ready. He's calm. He knows what to do. Trust the process. Trust the process. Sarah wanted to laugh. The process had failed Emma for 18 months. The process had allowed her to remain traumatized, silent, imprisoned in her own shattered mind. Now they were asking a 3-year-old child to trust the process. They were asking a dog to be the bridge between justice and injustice. It all felt impossibly fragile, like standing on the edge of a cliff and hoping that the wind wouldn't push you over. At 7:30 a.m., Sarah drove to the safe house where Emma had been staying. Foster mother Janet met her at the door, Emma clutching her hand, the little girl's face pale and anxious. Emma wore a pink dress with white flowers, Janet's deliberate choice to make her feel special, to armor her with something beautiful before she had to face something ugly. The dress hung on Emma's small frame like a costume, something she was wearing to play a role in an adult tragedy. "How is she?" Sarah asked gently, crouching down to Emma's eye level. Emma didn't respond. Of course she didn't. The selective mutism remained absolute, unbroken, like an impenetrable wall surrounding the child's consciousness. But Emma's eyes tracked Sarah's movements, and her small hand reached out tentatively, as if seeking reassurance. Sarah took the tiny hand in hers, feeling the smallness of it, the vulnerability of it, the heartbreaking fragility of a 3-year-old who'd experienced more trauma than most people encounter in a lifetime. "You're going to be so brave today," Sarah whispered. "And you won't be alone. Duke will be there with you. Duke is your friend. Duke is safe." Emma's eyes widened slightly at the mention of Duke. In the past week, Sarah and Mike had arranged for Emma to spend time with Duke at the safe house. The dog had been introduced slowly, carefully, with the gentleness of a creature who understood the fragility of traumatized beings. Duke would lie beside Emma's chair, not demanding attention, simply being present, his warm body a constant comfort. Emma had eventually reached out and touched the dog's fur. She'd leaned against him during one therapy session. The connection between the child and the dog was growing, becoming a lifeline. The drive to the courthouse took 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. Sarah kept glancing in the rearview mirror at Emma, who sat in a booster seat, staring out the window at the rain-soaked Portland streets. The city looked gray and colorless, drained of joy, reflecting the somber nature of what was about to unfold. When they arrived at the courthouse, Sarah parked in the underground garage to avoid the media circus gathering outside. She escorted Emma and Janet through the back entrance, avoiding the reporters' shouted questions, the camera flashes that exploded like lightning. They made their way through the building's corridors to a quiet room designated for child witnesses, a space designed to feel safe, with soft furniture, toys, and books meant to calm anxious young witnesses before they had to testify. Officer Mike Chen was already there with Duke. The moment Emma saw the dog, her entire body seemed to relax. She let go of Janet's hand and walked toward Duke, drawn to him like metal to a magnet. Duke remained perfectly still, his breathing calm, his body language communicating safety and acceptance. Emma reached out and placed her small hand on Duke's head, and Sarah felt her own chest tighten with emotion. "He's ready," Mike said quietly to Sarah. "And so is she, I think, as ready as any 3-year-old can be." At 9 a.m., the courtroom doors opened. Sarah had been inside the courtroom dozens of times during jury selection and preliminary hearings, but it still felt overwhelming. The high ceilings, the polished wood, the aura of authority and tradition that seemed to emanate from every surface. Judge Patricia Woodson sat elevated on her bench, looking even more severe than usual. The jury box held 12 citizens who'd been carefully selected to judge the guilt or innocence of a man accused of unspeakable crimes against a child. And then there was Robert Vasquez. He sat at the defense table, handcuffed to the heavy wooden chair, wearing a suit that made him look almost respectable, almost human. His attorney, a sharp-featured man named David Richardson who'd made his career defending the indefensible, sat beside him, whispering last-minute strategy. Vasquez's face was calm, composed, almost smug. He'd posted bail. He was out in the world. He'd had time to prepare his defense, to coach potential witnesses, to build his narrative of innocence. Sarah felt rage bloom in her chest like a dark flower. This man had stolen 18 months of a child's life. He'd stolen her voice, her safety, her innocence. And now he sat in a courtroom, presumed innocent by law, waiting to see if the system would hold him accountable. Emma was brought into the courtroom by the bailiff, walking beside Janet, her small figure dwarfed by the courtroom's grandeur. She was placed in the witness box, a wooden chair elevated higher than normal so the jury could see her. The oath was administered by the court clerk, who gently explained that Emma should tell the truth, that lying was wrong. Emma said nothing, of course, but she looked directly at Judge Woodson, and the judge nodded with understanding. The prosecutor, Jennifer Hayes, stood. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a voice that commanded respect. She'd prepared extensively for this moment, and Sarah could see the tension in her shoulders, the weight of knowing that everything depended on what happened in the next few minutes. "Your Honor," Jennifer said formally, "the child witness may need therapeutic support during her testimony. With the court's permission, we'd like Officer Duke, a trained police dog with therapeutic certification, to be present within sight of the witness." The defense attorney immediately stood up in protest. "Objection! Your Honor, this is theatrical manipulation designed to prejudice the jury in favor of the child's testimony. The presence of a dog will unfairly influence the jury's perception of the witness's credibility and reliability. This is highly inappropriate and legally unwarranted." Judge Woodson raised her hand. "I've reviewed the precedent, Mr. Richardson. Support animals are permitted in courtrooms as accommodations for witnesses. The question before this court is whether this child's ability to testify is genuinely dependent on this accommodation. Detective Martinez, do you have evidence that this child cannot testify without the dog's presence?" Sarah stood, her heart pounding. "Your Honor, this child has been completely non-responsive to all traditional interviewing techniques since her rescue. She has selective mutism resulting from severe trauma." However, in therapeutic sessions with Officer Duke present, she has shown measurable improvements in anxiety levels and has made attempts at communication. The dog is not a prop, Your Honor. The dog is a medical accommodation, analogous to a hearing aid or a wheelchair. Judge Woodson considered this carefully. Sarah could see the weight of the decision in the judge's eyes. Finally, she spoke. The dog may remain within the witness's line of sight, but the dog must remain silent, calm, and non-interactive during testimony. This is a one-time accommodation granted solely based on the child's demonstrated need. Do both parties understand? The defense attorney nodded reluctantly. Jennifer Hayes nodded gratefully. Mike Chen walked Duke into the courtroom, and gasps rippled through the gallery. The golden German Shepherd was magnificent, perfectly groomed, collar gleaming, every inch the professional that he'd been trained to be. He walked with calm authority beside Mike, his intelligence evident in every movement. Mike positioned Duke exactly 6 feet from the witness box and gave the command to sit. Duke obeyed instantly, his body relaxing into a perfect sitting position, his brown eyes focused on Emma with absolute gentleness. Emma's entire body transformed. The tension that had held her rigid seemed to dissolve. Her breathing slowed, her shoulders lowered. She looked at Duke, and Duke looked back at her, and in that moment something sacred passed between them, an acknowledgement, a promise, a connection that transcended species and spoke directly to the ancient human need to feel safe. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the court reporter seemed to be holding her breath. Judge Woodson nodded to the prosecutor. You may proceed with your examination. Jennifer Hayes took a breath and asked the question that would determine whether justice could finally be served. Emma, sweetheart, can you tell us what happened? Emma opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Her lips moved silently, like a fish gasping for air, her vocal cords attempting to produce sound but failing, betrayed by the trauma that had locked them shut. The courtroom held its collective breath. Seconds stretched into eternity. Sarah felt her heart begin to sink, felt the fragile hope that had sustained her for weeks start to crumble like ancient stone. Then Emma glanced at Duke. The dog's tail moved in a single, deliberate wag, not enthusiastic or exuberant but calm and reassuring, as if communicating directly to the child's fractured psyche. I'm here. You're safe. You can do this. It was such a small gesture, barely noticeable to most people in the courtroom, but to Emma it was everything. It was the anchor she needed, the lifeline that would pull her from the drowning depths of her trauma. Emma's shoulders relaxed infinitesimally. Her breathing, which had become rapid and shallow, slowed to a more natural rhythm. She looked back at Jennifer Hayes, and in her eyes the prosecutor saw a glimmer of something that hadn't been there before, a fragile determination, a whisper of courage. It's okay, Emma, Jennifer said softly, her voice gentle but firm, the voice of someone who'd spent years learning how to speak to traumatized children. Take your time. There's no rush. Can you tell me about the day you went to the park? Emma's small hand trembled in her lap. Her thumb moved toward her mouth, that regressive comfort mechanism that had become her constant companion. But then she seemed to think better of it. She pulled her hand back and looked at Duke again. The dog's ears had perked forward slightly, his brown eyes absolutely focused on her, as if he could somehow absorb her fear and transform it into courage. Then, in a voice so small it seemed impossible that such a tiny human could produce it, Emma spoke her first words in 18 months. Park. Flowers. The courtroom erupted internally, not with audible noise, but with the collective shock of witnessing a miracle. Reporters leaned forward. Jury members' eyes widened. Even the bailiff seemed to straighten in his chair, sensing that something momentous was occurring. That's right, Emma, Jennifer continued, her own voice thick with barely suppressed emotion. You were at the park looking at flowers, and then what happened? Emma's eyes darted to the defendant's table. She looked directly at Robert Vasquez, and for a moment the monster's composure cracked. He shifted in his chair, uncomfortable under the weight of a child's gaze, his smugness evaporating like morning mist. "Man came," Emma whispered. "Bad man, he said flowers, said pretty flowers." Sarah felt tears stream down her face. She wasn't alone. In the gallery, Emma's mother, who'd been sitting in the front row throughout the entire trial, her face a mask of anguish, began to sob quietly, her shoulders shaking with the weight of finally hearing her daughter's voice. "Did you know this man, Emma?" Jennifer asked gently. Emma shook her head. She glanced at Duke again, and the dog tilted his head slightly, not in a way that was interactive or distracting, but in a way that communicated absolute presence, absolute solidarity. It was perfect. The dog was neither coaching her nor distracting her. He was simply being what a traumatized child needed most, a non-judgmental witness, a safe presence, a creature who asked nothing but offered everything. "The man took me away from the park," Emma continued, her voice still barely audible but becoming slightly stronger with each word. "He put me in truck, dark truck." "And then what happened, Emma? Where did he take you?" Emma's eyes grew distant. She began to rock slightly in her chair, a self-soothing behavior. But she didn't look away from Duke, and the dog didn't look away from her. Their connection became a tether, keeping Emma anchored in the present moment, preventing her from completely disappearing into the traumatic memories she was being asked to describe. Downstairs. Dark place," Emma said, her voice becoming slightly stronger, as if speaking the words was beginning to break the spell of silence that had held her captive. "Blue door. He locked blue door." Sarah watched the jury members' faces. She could see it happening, the shift from skepticism to belief, from doubt to conviction. This was real. This wasn't a coached child reciting rehearsed lines. This was a traumatized 3-year-old excavating the most painful memories of her life, doing so with the courage of a warrior. "Emma, I need to ask you a very important question," Jennifer said carefully. "The man who took you to the dark place with the blue door, is he in this courtroom right now?" There was a pregnant pause. Emma looked away from Duke for the first time, her eyes scanning the courtroom. She found the defendant's table. She looked directly at Robert Vasquez. "That man," she said, pointing with a small, trembling finger. "That man, bad man, he hurt Emma. He hurt Emma bad." The defense attorney stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Objection. Your Honor, this is leading, suggestive testimony. The child is clearly being coached." "Overruled," Judge Woodson said sharply, her voice cutting through his protest like a knife. "The child has sufficiently identified the defendant. Continue, Ms. Hayes." What followed over the next 2 hours was extraordinary and devastating. With Duke's presence anchoring her, Emma found her voice. The words came haltingly at first, then with increasing coherence. She described the basement. She described the blue door. She described the darkness, the cold, the sounds of things she couldn't understand. When asked where the bad man had hurt her, she indicated her body with the clinical accuracy of a child who'd been medically examined, but hadn't yet developed the language to process what had happened to her. She described his voice. Deep, angry voice. He said mean things, said Emma bad, said Emma deserve hurt. She described his appearance. His tattoo on his left arm, a detailed description that matched the tattoo on Robert Vasquez's visible arm. His scar above his left eye, a scar clearly visible on the defendant's face. She described the smell of cigarettes and something else she couldn't identify. She described being fed food that tasted bad, being kept in clothes that were too big, being cold all the time. And with each detail, the case against Robert Vasquez solidified. What had been circumstantial became visceral. What had been abstract became real. A jury of 12 ordinary Portland citizens sat transfixed, watching a 3-year-old girl describe hell in the only way a 3-year-old could. Simple words, broken sentences, but undeniable truth. At one point, Emma seemed to falter. Her voice became quieter. Her hands began to shake. She looked away from Duke, and immediately her breathing became rapid, her anxiety spiking. But the moment the prosecutor paused and gave Mike a signal, Duke's tail wagged once, that same calm, reassuring gesture. Emma looked at the dog, and the anxiety seemed to drain from her small body. She took a breath and continued. "He said nobody believe Emma," she whispered. "He said Emma crazy. He said Emma lie." Sarah felt rage burn through her chest. This monster had tried to silence her through psychological manipulation, through the insidious suggestion that a traumatized child's own mind would betray her, that no one would believe her, that her voice didn't matter. But Emma's voice was mattering. It was echoing through the courtroom like thunder, like justice finally finding its voice. By the time Jennifer finished her examination, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The jury members looked shaken, devastated, but absolutely convinced. Even the judge seemed to be struggling with her composure, her usual judicial detachment cracking under the weight of what she just witnessed. The defense attorney stood for cross-examination, but it was half-hearted. What could he do? Cross-examine a traumatized 3-year-old, attack a child's description of her own abuse. The jury would crucify him. He asked a few perfunctory questions, none of which Emma answered differently. Her story remained consistent, unchanged, undeniable. When Jennifer Hayes announced, "No further questions, Your Honor," Emma finally allowed herself to look away from Duke. The dog stood up immediately, not aggressively, not dramatically, but with the calm understanding that his job was done. He'd done what he was trained to do. He'd been the bridge between a broken child and the voice she desperately needed to reclaim. As the bailiff helped Emma down from the witness box, the little girl walked directly to Duke and wrapped her arms around the dog's neck. Duke stood perfectly still, allowing the child to bury her face in his golden fur, to feel the warmth and safety of a creature who'd stood beside her through the darkest testimony of her young life. The courtroom erupted in silent tears. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath in the aftermath of Emma's identification. Sarah watched the jury members' faces, seeing the transformation happening in real time, the shift from skepticism to absolute belief, from doubt to conviction. What had been theoretically possible now became undeniably real. The monster at the defense table was no longer an abstraction, a legal question mark. He was a man who'd stolen a child's innocence, who'd locked her in darkness, who'd inflicted horrors that a 3-year-old's vocabulary could barely encompass. Jennifer Hayes, the prosecutor, took a moment to compose herself before continuing. Her hands trembled slightly as she shuffled through her notes, and Sarah could see the emotion barely contained behind her professional veneer. This was why Jennifer had become a prosecutor. Moments like this, when justice actually had a chance of prevailing, when a child's voice could be heard and believed and acted upon. "Emma, I want to ask you some more questions, if that's okay," Jennifer said gently, her voice carefully calibrated to maintain the delicate balance between getting the testimony she needed and not pushing the traumatized child beyond her capacity. "I know this is very hard. You're doing so well. Can you tell me more about what the bad man did in the dark place?" Emma had retreated back into the witness box, and immediately her anxiety began to spike. Her breathing became rapid. Her small hands clenched into fists. But then Mike Chen signaled Duke, and the dog, understanding the cue from countless training sessions, approached slightly closer, his body language communicating calm, grounding presence. Duke didn't move into the witness box, wouldn't violate the boundaries that had been established, but his proximity seemed to create an invisible circle of safety around the traumatized child. He made Emma take off clothes," Emma said, her voice so quiet that the court stenographer had to lean forward to hear. "He said look at bad man. He said Emma lucky. He said Emma should be grateful." Sarah's jaw clenched. The psychological manipulation embedded in those words was devastating. This predator hadn't just physically abused this child. He tried to reframe the abuse, to convince her that she should be grateful, that she was lucky. It was the twisted logic of someone who'd constructed an entire narrative to justify his evil. "And how long did you stay in the dark place, Emma?" Jennifer continued. Long time, Emma said, rocking slightly in her chair. Many sleeps. Many times he came, many times he hurt. Did he hurt you every day? Emma nodded, then seemed to realize that wasn't sufficient testimony. Yes, every day, morning time, night time, he hurt Emma every day. The jury members' faces had gone pale. One woman, a mother, Sarah could tell by the way her hand instinctively went to her chest, looked like she might be sick. Another jury member, an older man, had tears streaming freely down his face, his expression a mixture of horror and helpless rage. And then what happened, Emma? How did you get away from the bad man? Emma's eyes grew distant. She seemed to be looking through the courtroom walls, back to that basement, back to that blue door, back to the darkness that had defined her world for those horrific weeks. I ran, she said simply. The door was open one time. Bad man was sleeping. I ran and ran and ran, through trees, through water. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. Sarah felt her heart break for this tiny girl who demonstrated more courage than most adults could muster. A 3-year-old, traumatized and injured, had escaped her captor through sheer determination and will to survive. She'd navigated through an unknown environment, through forests and water, with no knowledge of where she was or where she was going, driven only by the primal human instinct to escape danger. And that's when someone found you by the river, Jennifer asked. Yes, Emma whispered. A man, he was running, he found Emma, he was nice, he called people. Over the next hour and a half, Emma's testimony continued. She described the physical injuries, pointing to scars on her small body, explaining where the bad man had hurt her, describing pain with the limited vocabulary of a 3-year-old but with devastating clarity. She described the food he'd given her, describing it as bad taste and make Emma sick. She described the sounds, describing his voice, the sounds of the basement, the sounds of traffic outside that sometimes penetrated the darkness. With each detail, with each answer, the case against Robert Vasquez became more airtight. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutally difficult to watch. He was doing his job, defending his client, but the job of defending a child abuser was inherently indefensible. Every question he asked seemed to further damn his client. Isn't it possible, Emma, that you're confused about what happened? He asked at one point, his voice taking on that condescending tone that some attorneys used when questioning child witnesses. Emma looked at Duke. Duke's ears perked forward slightly, his body language communicating presence and support. No, Emma said firmly, her voice stronger than it had been all day. Emma not confused. Emma remember. Bad man hurt Emma. Emma remember bad man face. But you were only 3 years old when this happened. Children your age often have false memories. Isn't it possible? No, Emma interrupted, her small voice cutting through his attempted manipulation like a sword. Emma remember everything. Emma want tell. There was something in her voice in that moment, a determination, a clarity, an absolute certainty that transcended her age. She wasn't just a confused 3-year-old. She was a survivor. She was a witness. She was telling the truth, and on some level that penetrated even the defense attorney's professional armor, he seemed to understand that. The cross-examination ended after 40 minutes. The defense attorney had nothing. There was no hole in Emma's testimony, no contradiction, no indication of coaching or false memory. She described events with the kind of specific detail that only an eyewitness could provide. She'd identified her abuser with absolute certainty. She'd explained her escape with the clarity of someone who'd lived through it. When Jennifer announced no further questions, Emma visibly sagged with relief. The ordeal of testimony was over. She'd done it. She'd faced the darkness and spoken it into light. As the bailiff helped Emma down from the witness box, the little girl didn't go to her foster mother or to Jennifer Hayes. She walked directly to Duke and the dog, understanding the sacredness of the moment, lay down on the courtroom floor, allowing Emma to curl up against his warm, golden body. Officer Mike Chen didn't pull the dog away. Judge Woodson didn't object. Even the bailiff stood quietly, allowing this moment of human-animal connection to unfold. Courtroom had become a space of profound emotion. Reporters were frantically scribbling notes. Photographers' cameras flashed silently. In the gallery, Emma's mother sobbed quietly, her face buried in her hands, finally able to release the anguish she'd been containing for 18 months. Emma's father sat beside her, his arm around her, tears streaming down his face as he watched his daughter, this brave, broken, recovering little girl, find solace in the presence of a dog who'd given her the gift of her voice. The recess was called. Everyone filed out of the courtroom, but the energy had fundamentally shifted. The case was no longer abstract. It was no longer about circumstantial evidence and legal procedure. It was about a monster who'd stolen a child's innocence, and a child who'd found the courage to name him. Sarah found Mike Chen in the hallway outside the courtroom. The officer was holding Duke's leash, the dog calm and composed as if he hadn't just participated in one of the most significant moments in the trial. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Thank you for believing in this. Thank you for bringing Duke." "Duke did the work," Mike replied, running his hand through the dog's golden fur. "I just walked him into the room. That child found her own courage. The dog just gave her permission to use it." Sarah knelt down and looked into Duke's intelligent brown eyes. "Thank you," she whispered to the dog. "Thank you for being her bridge." Duke's tail wagged once slowly, and Sarah understood that she was thanking a creature who existed purely in the moment, who didn't understand the legal implications of what had just occurred, but who understood something far more profound: the absolute necessity of standing beside broken beings and helping them find their way back to wholeness. The rest of the trial proceeded with the weight of inevitability. Expert witnesses testified about the physical evidence. Forensic specialists explained DNA findings. The medical examiner described the injuries consistent with prolonged child abuse. Medical photographs were entered into evidence, photographs so devastating that several jury members had to look away. But nothing compared to Emma's testimony. Nothing compared to a 3-year-old girl pointing at her abuser and saying, "Bad man. He hurt Emma." That moment would be the emotional core of the case, the truth that no defense attorney could deconstruct, the voice that would echo through the jury's deliberations and ultimately determine the fate of the man accused of stealing a child's childhood. The jury deliberation room was silent except for the sound of papers shuffling and the occasional throat being cleared. 12 ordinary Portland citizens sat around a long table, their faces bearing the weight of the decision they'd been tasked with making. The evidence against Robert Vasquez was overwhelming: DNA, fiber analysis, Emma's testimony, the medical examinations, the expert witnesses. But jury deliberations could be unpredictable. Sarah had learned long ago never to take anything for granted in the legal system. She sat in the courthouse hallway outside the deliberation room, her leg bouncing nervously, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had turned white. 18 months. Everything depended on the next few hours. Everything they'd worked for, everything Emma had endured and overcome, would be determined by 12 people locked in a room, debating the guilt or innocence of a man who'd inflicted unspeakable horrors on a child. Officer Mike Chen sat beside her, Duke's leash wrapped around his hand. The dog lay at their feet, his golden head resting on his paws, seemingly unbothered by the tension radiating from the humans around him. Sarah envied the dog's ability to exist in the present moment, to not carry the weight of what might happen, to simply be. Jennifer Hayes walked past, coffee cup in hand, her expression carefully neutral. But Sarah could see the anxiety in the prosecutor's eyes, the same fear that was consuming Sarah. They'd made their case. They'd presented the evidence. They'd put a traumatized child on the witness stand, and somehow, miraculously, that child had found her voice. But the legal system was a strange beast. Juries could be unpredictable. Emotions could sway verdicts. Reasonable doubt could creep in through the smallest cracks. "How long do you think?" Sarah asked quietly. "Could be hours, could be days," Jennifer replied, sitting down heavily beside Sarah. A quick verdict could go either way. Quick guilty verdicts happen when the evidence is overwhelming. Quick acquittals happen when the jury thinks the case is too weak. This is impossible to predict. 3 hours passed, then 4, then 6. Sarah's stomach twisted into knots so tight she thought she might vomit. She'd stopped eating at some point during the trial, stress and anxiety suppressing her appetite. Her clothes hung loose on her frame. She'd lost 15 pounds over the course of the investigation and trial, her body physically manifesting the toll that the case had extracted. Then at 4:15 p.m., a bailiff appeared in the hallway. "The jury has reached a verdict," he announced. Sarah's heart seemed to stop. The moment had come. Everything they'd fought for, everything Emma had endured, would be determined in the next few minutes. She stood up on shaky legs, her hands trembling. The courtroom filled quickly. Emma wasn't present. The judge had ruled that a child witness shouldn't be in the courtroom for the verdict, to spare her the potential trauma of seeing her abuser's reaction if he was found not guilty. Emma was with her foster mother in a safe location, waiting to hear the outcome. But Emma's parents were there, sitting in the front row, their faces pale with anxiety. Robert Vasquez was brought in, still wearing the suit that made him look almost respectable, still maintaining that veneer of calm composure that suggested he believed the system would protect him. His attorney placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, a gesture designed to suggest confidence. Judge Patricia Woodson entered and took her seat on the bench. The jury filed in, 12 faces bearing the strain of the decision they'd made. Sarah studied their expressions, trying to read the verdict in their eyes. Some looked devastated. Some looked grim. Some looked relieved. She couldn't tell which way they'd gone. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Woodson asked formally. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes, stood up. "We have, Your Honor." "Please read the verdicts," the judge instructed. The foreman opened the verdict form with trembling hands. Sarah held her breath. "On the charge of kidnapping in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty," the foreman said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the decision. Emma's mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her husband grabbed her, holding her as tears began to stream down her face. "On the charge of rape in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." Sarah felt something inside her chest crack open. "On the charge of child abuse in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." "On the charge of unlawful imprisonment, we find the defendant guilty." The verdicts continued, one after another, guilty, guilty, guilty. Robert Vasquez's composure finally cracked. His face went pale. His attorney's reassuring hand fell away as the lawyer realized the case was lost, completely and utterly lost. "On all charges, we find the defendant guilty," the foreman concluded. The courtroom erupted. Not with noise, the judge quickly called for order, but with the profound release of tension that had been building for months. Emma's parents held each other, sobbing with a mixture of grief and relief. The gallery erupted in quiet tears. Reporters immediately began texting updates to their outlets. Judge Woodson dismissed the jury with thanks, her own voice thick with emotion. She then turned to the defendant. "Mr. Vasquez, you have been found guilty on all counts. Sentencing will take place in 2 weeks. Until that time, you will remain in custody without bail." The bailiffs moved forward to take Vasquez away. For the first time, he looked completely broken, the mask of composure shattered. He looked like what he was, a predator caught, a monster exposed, a man facing the consequences of his evil. Sarah walked out of the courtroom in a daze. The hallway was filled with reporters, all of them shouting questions, cameras flashing like lightning. She pushed through them, desperate to get away, desperate to process what had just happened. Officer Mike Chen was waiting in a quiet corner with Duke. Sarah went to them immediately, and without thinking, she wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, burying her face in his golden fur. Duke's tail wagged slowly, his presence a constant comfort. "We did it," Mike said quietly. "Emma did it, she brought him down." "No," Sarah replied, pulling back to look at the dog. "Duke brought her up. He gave her the space to find her voice." Over the next 2 weeks, the news cycle exploded with coverage of the case. The story, a 3-year-old girl overcoming trauma to testify against her abuser, aided by a specially trained police dog, captured the public's imagination and heart. Media outlets ran human interest pieces. Social media erupted with support for Emma, for Duke, for the entire justice system apparatus that had somehow managed to work the way it was supposed to work. Sentencing day arrived. Robert Vasquez was brought before Judge Woodson in shackles, the illusion of respectability completely stripped away. The judge delivered her verdict, consecutive sentences totaling 147 years without possibility of parole. The monster would die in prison. Emma's mother stood up in the courtroom and spoke directly to her daughter's abuser. "You will never hurt another child. You will spend every day of the rest of your life thinking about what you did, knowing that you're in prison because a 3-year-old girl found the courage to speak the truth. You thought you could silence her with fear and manipulation, but you couldn't, and now you'll face the consequences." The courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Woodson didn't silence it this time. She allowed it to continue, allowing the community's collective relief and justice to be expressed. In the weeks following sentencing, Sarah visited Emma regularly. The little girl was beginning to heal. She was talking more, laughing more, slowly reclaiming the childhood that had been stolen from her. She'd been placed with adoptive parents, David and Michelle Chen, ironically related to Officer Mike Chen. They were loving, patient, committed to helping Emma process her trauma and rebuild her life. Duke remained a constant in Emma's recovery. The therapeutic dog would visit regularly, lying beside the little girl while she drew pictures, while she played, while she slowly began to understand that the world contained safety alongside danger, that not all people were predators, that recovery was possible. Sarah watched these interactions and understood something profound. The legal system had worked not because of procedures or precedent, but because of one child's courage, one dog's compassion, and the collective decision of a community to stand up and say that such evil would not be tolerated. Justice had prevailed, not because the system was perfect, it wasn't, but because a traumatized 3-year-old girl had found her voice, and 12 ordinary citizens had listened, believed, and acted. 6 months after Robert Vasquez's sentencing, Emma sat in the backseat of a car heading north toward Seattle, her small face pressed against the window, watching the landscape of Oregon transform into the landscape of Washington. The little girl who'd been silent, traumatized, and broken had been replaced by someone fundamentally different, a child who laughed, who asked questions, who engaged with the world with cautious curiosity. Her hair had grown longer, her dimples had returned, and her eyes, once hollow with trauma, now sparkled with the resilience of childhood. Beside her sat her new adoptive mother, Michelle Chen, who'd spent the past 6 months learning the complicated art of parenting a traumatized child. Michelle was a middle school teacher, patient and nurturing, someone who understood that healing wasn't linear, that progress came in small increments, that setbacks were part of the journey. She held Emma's hand as they drove, occasionally pointing out interesting sights. "Look, Emma, a deer," normalizing the world, rebuilding Emma's capacity to experience wonder. David Chen, Michelle's husband, sat in the driver's seat, his eyes occasionally meeting Emma's in the rearview mirror, checking in, silently communicating that this was her family now, that she was safe, that she was loved. David was a social worker, someone who dedicated his career to helping vulnerable children. He and Michelle had been waiting for months to finalize Emma's adoption, and today was the day they were bringing her home to Seattle, to her new bedroom, to her new life. But before they left Portland, there was one final goodbye that needed to happen. Officer Mike Chen had arranged a special afternoon at the training facility where Duke spent his days when he wasn't on police work. Sarah Martinez met them there, along with a handful of other officers who'd worked on the case. The facility was a large, open space with agility equipment, training obstacles, and plenty of room for a dog to run and play. Duke was brought out by his handler, and the moment Emma saw the golden dog, she broke into the biggest smile Sarah had seen from her yet. The little girl ran as fast as her 3-year-old legs could carry her, and Duke bounded toward her with equal enthusiasm. They met in the middle of the training facility, and Emma threw her arms around Duke's neck. Duke, Emma going to new home," Emma announced, her words tumbling out in the excited way of a child who discovered the power of speech. Duke's tail wagged so hard his entire body shook. The dog seemed to understand that this was a significant moment, that the connection between him and this child had transformed both of them in profound ways. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. She'd spent 18 months investigating this case, 18 months consumed by the search for justice for this child. But standing here, watching Emma laugh and play with Duke, watching her experience joy and safety, she understood that justice wasn't just about putting a monster in prison. Justice was about enabling a child to reclaim her life, to experience love, to believe in a future that contained possibility. For the next hour, Emma and Duke played together. The little girl threw a tennis ball, and Duke retrieved it with the enthusiasm of a dog who'd been trained to love the game, but who also seemed to understand that making this child happy was the most important assignment of his life. Emma climbed over agility obstacles with Duke beside her, the dog never leaving her side. She ran through the facility, and Duke ran with her, matching her pace, celebrating her joy. Michelle and David watched from the sidelines, both of them visibly moved by what they were witnessing. This dog had been instrumental in saving their daughter's life. This dog had given Emma the gift of her voice. This dog had enabled justice to prevail in a system that might otherwise have failed. Officer Mike Chen approached Sarah as they watched the child and dog play. "She's going to be okay," he said quietly. "Kids are resilient. With the right support, with love, with time, she's going to build a beautiful life." "Because of Duke," Sarah said. "Because of you bringing him into that courtroom." "No," Mike replied, shaking his head. "Because of Emma. That little girl had more courage than most adults I know. Duke just gave her permission to use it." As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that Emma and Duke needed to part ways. The little girl was exhausted, happy but tired, ready for the drive to Seattle. Mike called Duke back, and the dog came immediately, his training overriding his emotional attachment, though anyone could see the reluctance in his movements. Emma looked at Duke, and something passed between them, a recognition that their partnership had served its purpose, that Emma no longer needed Duke to find her voice because the voice was now hers, permanently, irrevocably hers. "Thank you, Duke," Emma said, her small voice carrying a maturity that seemed impossible for a 3-year-old. "Thank you for helping Emma." Duke's tail wagged once slowly, a benediction. Sarah knelt down and hugged Emma, inhaling the scent of her hair, feeling the small warmth of her body. "You're so brave," Sarah whispered. "You're so strong. Never forget that." "Emma, remember," the little girl replied, nodding seriously. "Emma, remember Duke. Emma, remember Detective Sarah." Then Emma was being carried to the car by David, waving goodbye as they pulled out of the facility. Sarah and Mike and the other officers stood watching until the car disappeared from sight. Over the following years, Sarah received Christmas cards from Seattle. The first card, arriving that December, showed a photograph of Emma with her new family, David and Michelle, and a rescue golden retriever named Duke, because Emma had insisted. Emma was smiling, genuinely smiling, surrounded by love and safety. The second Christmas card showed Emma at age 4, reading a book to her golden dog, her face peaceful and happy. The third card showed her at age 5, starting kindergarten, her backpack covered in stickers, her smile radiating confidence. Sarah kept every single card on the wall of her office, a visual record of a child's journey from trauma to recovery, from silence to voice, from victim to survivor. Officer Mike Chen continued his work with police dogs, and Duke became something of a legend in law enforcement circles. Other departments requested the dog's assistance in high-profile cases. A documentary filmmaker approached Mike about creating a feature about Duke and Emma's case, but Mike always maintained that the real story wasn't about the dog. It was about a 3-year-old girl who'd summoned the courage to speak her truth in the face of evil. Emma's case became a watershed moment in child advocacy law. Several states modified their courtroom procedures to allow therapeutic animals to be present during child testimony. Universities began expanding their animal-assisted therapy programs. The story of a little girl and a dog resonated with something fundamental in the human heart: the understanding that healing requires connection, that trauma can be overcome, that justice, when it works, has the power to transform not just individual lives but entire systems. 5 years after the trial, Sarah received a phone call. It was Emma's mother, the woman who'd collapsed in terror at Riverside Park all those years ago. "Detective Martinez," the woman said, her voice warm and filled with gratitude. "I wanted you to know that Emma is thriving. She's in 2nd grade now. She's confident, happy, surrounded by love. She has nightmares sometimes, and there are days when the trauma surfaces, but overall, she's building a beautiful life." "Thank you for telling me," Sarah replied, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for calling." "No, thank you," Emma's mother said. "Thank you for never giving up. Thank you for bringing Duke into that courtroom. Thank you for helping my daughter reclaim her voice." Sarah hung up the phone and looked at the Christmas cards on her office wall. The most recent one showed Emma at age 8, standing with both her dogs, the rescue golden retriever named Duke and a new family dog, a gentle German shepherd named Justice. Justice. The word seemed to encapsulate everything that had happened, everything that had been accomplished, everything that had been restored. Not the harsh, punitive justice of a man spending the rest of his life in prison, though that mattered, but the deeper, more meaningful justice of a child reclaiming her life, finding her voice, building a future filled with love and safety and hope. Sarah thought about that moment in the courtroom when Emma had pointed at Robert Vasquez and spoken those 2 simple words: "Bad man." Those words had changed everything. Those words had been the key that unlocked a justice system that might otherwise have failed. Those words had been spoken with the help of a dog who'd understood, in his own way, the sacred responsibility of standing beside the broken and helping them find their wholeness. Sarah kept the Christmas cards coming. Every year, without fail, Emma sent a card. The latest one, arriving on Sarah's desk in December of Emma's 11th year, showed a photograph of a confident, beautiful girl with blonde hair and dimples, standing between her 2 adoptive parents, her arms around both of them. Inside, in careful, mature handwriting, Emma had written, "Dear Detective Sarah and Officer Mike and Duke, I'm 11 now and doing really well. I'm in 6th grade. I'm on the soccer team. I have a best friend named Maya. I'm learning to play the piano. I have nightmares sometimes, but not as much as before. I'm healing. Thank you for helping me find my voice. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for bringing Duke into my life. I will never forget. Love, Emma." Sarah read the card 3 times, and each time she cried. Not tears of sadness, but tears of profound gratitude that the system, despite all its flaws and failures, had managed to work the way it was supposed to work. That justice, true justice, had prevailed. That a child had been heard, believed, protected, and ultimately healed. She pinned the card to the wall beside the others, creating a timeline of recovery, a visual record of how far one little girl had traveled from the darkness of trauma to the light of a life filled with love, safety, and possibility. Sometimes the smallest voices speak the loudest truths. Sometimes the greatest witnesses have 4 legs and unconditional love. And sometimes justice, real, meaningful, transformative justice, arrives not through the machinery of the law, but through the courage of a child and the compassion of a dog who understood, in his own profound way, that standing beside the broken is the most sacred work that any being can do.